Hello everyone, Hafsa here. So now that we've learned a little bit more about how we do animation in the last lesson, we want to put the things that we've learned into actual use and start and create some really interesting animations, because up until now we've only used a simple object or very simple actions. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you how I approach my animation and how I think when I'm trying to connect movements and create interesting and realistic actions. For this lesson, I'm going to show very simple full body movements with a front view, nothing too complicated, no foreshortening, nothing like that. We're just going to see simple connected movements and learn how we break them down and how we can find the correct timing and poses for our animation. This applies to both simple actions, complex actions, and we will be using the same type of thinking when going forward into more cinematic animation with more difficult angles. I'll be demonstrating with human forms, but this type of analytical thinking is good for both objects, animals, any other creatures, and of course humans. What I'm going to teach you today is actually how to analyze a movement and how to break complex movement down into simpler actions that are easy to time and plan trajectories for, as well as how to connect multiple unrelated trajectories. When following the exercises in this lesson, please try and match the amount of complex movements that you're going to add. I'm going to combine around 3 to 4 actions within each demonstration, but you can always do it with 1 or 2 actions as long as you have just a good understanding of the entire body movement and some connecting movements so you can practice everything. I recommend making exercises of between 1 to 3 seconds. Of course, if you're more experienced, you can try and go beyond this number of seconds and beyond this number of poses. But remember that we're going to be using this exercise for the next lesson of adding details and character designs to our animation. So you don't want to have something that is too complex or too long, which will be harder to do in the next lesson. With that out of the way, let us begin. A lot of the time, when people just start to animate, they try and rely on their intuitive understanding of movement, and a lot of the times they will make a lot of versions of the movement until it looks good, without understanding the reason behind what made it work. A lot of the time you will also hear corrections, such as give it more weight or make it more energetic, and you wouldn't really know how to correct these things if you don't already have a lot of experience. Most of the time, animators improve slowly due to working in the industry and gaining a lot of experience in the actual field, or with using a lot of reference to improve their craft. Now, this is important and can give you a lot of steady progress, and of course, the more you animate, the better you're going to become. But if you don't actually think about what you're doing, your progress will be a lot slower than if you understand the reason behind the movement and actions. Using a lot of reference and a lot of practice of a certain type without branching out to different areas can actually kind of harm you as an animator, because you will be limited by the type of references that you're going to use, and you might get too comfortable with one style and one subject of animation, so you wouldn't be able to tackle different things when you get to them. This is especially problematic if you're doing animation with unrealistic character designs, which require good understanding of actual physics, because you wouldn't be able to find any reference or any experience with something like that because it's unrealistic and you might not have done it before. So, what we actually want to do is be able to animate any subject without any reference or previous experience with it. For this, we need to understand the universal rules of movement, which is actual physics. So, The first thing we're going to do before we start animating is actually understanding the properties of what we're going to animate, be it a character, an object, an effect, a design, an animal, whatever. We kind of talked about it a little bit in the first character design lesson, but we need to really understand the range of movement and the materials and the properties of the character that we're going to animate. You need to understand what are the character's proportions, how their joints work, how flexible they are, because these questions will help you understand which poses you can actually create while keeping your character in model and their movement realistic. Think about how their proportions affect their weight distribution, because for example, a character that is very tall and top-heavy will have a harder time to balance, while shorter and steadier characters will have easier time to balance but might not have the same amount of range of movement. If they have unconventional body proportions, they might have more difficulty moving certain limbs or creating certain actions because of their overall shape. Another thing to consider is what the character is made of. I know this might sound like a weird question to ask, but in the world of animation, some characters are going to be made out of rock or fire or water or any other uncommon material. So while seeing regular characters made out of flesh move in unrealistic ways is almost a staple of cartoon, if you're creating a character which is made out of interesting material, well, you can't find a reference for that. You need to understand how it moves by itself. By deciding how you're going to style your animation and how the character design is going to affect how they can possibly move, you can create the rules of your universe and understand how you can make aesthetically pleasing animation and break down the movement. Of course, you can just choose to ignore all the implication of your character design and basically not follow a certain rule of physics in your animated universe, but then you will have to consider each case of animation by itself, and it can be kind of difficult to create aesthetically pleasing animation because they are unrelated to reality. Now that we thought about our design and the implication of it in regards to the animation and proportions and range of movement, it's time to combine our animation techniques from our last lesson and our understanding of the character and create actual animation. In real life, force, mass, and acceleration are all dependent on each other. When a force is acting upon an object, it will always create some type of change in the state of the object. It can be either in the object position, its shapes, its temperature, or a combination of these three. The direction from which the force is coming from will decide the direction of the change which is applied to the object, and the size of the force decides the amount of change. We can visually represent this change by doing different type of manipulation on the objects of animation. So this will be visually represented by acceleration, mass, and the connection between them. To simplify, a force is shown by how quickly an object of a certain mass is going to accelerate or show a change in its initial state. This might sound kind of confusing, but it's actually pretty simple, and I will explain it with these two scenarios. In the first example, we have the same force affecting objects with different mass. Because the force is the same in both direction and size, the only thing that changes how it's visually represented is by how it's affecting the object of different masses. The bigger the mass, the smaller the amount of acceleration that the object is going to have, which is expressed by smaller changes in position between frames and a smaller overall trajectory, as well as an increased rate of the ease-out animation pattern. The smaller object, on the other hand, will move quicker and accelerate more slowly until it reaches its final resting position. In the second example, we have different forces affecting the object with the same mass. Here you can see that the object with less force is going to move a lot slower and have a smaller trajectory, as well as decelerate faster in comparison to the object with the larger amount of force acting upon it. The reason that it's important to understand this concept when trying to animate complicated movement is because you can ultimately divide a complicated object into a bunch of independently moving simple masses or objects which are connected to a singular object. And by understanding the mass of each part of the object or the body, you can predict the way that moving certain part of it will affect the rest of the body. Now that we understand how independent objects are connected to mass and force, let's see how we look at an object which is more complicated and is made out of multiple different masses which can move independently of each other. So, each object has its own center of mass, no matter what shape or material it is made of. This is the one point on which the entire object can be balanced, and it is dependent on the object's weight distribution. Think about the way that you balance a spoon on your finger. Even though the center of the spoon is in the middle of it, its actual point of balance is far closer to the ball part of the spoon, where most of the mass of the spoon is. Understanding this concept is important because when you understand the character's point of balance, you can understand how many poses you can make and how to connect them while keeping your character's movement natural. Basically, any type of action is just a series of balanced and unbalanced motions. This balance affects the entire position of your body because it will always try and self-correct itself. Unless, of course, you're making a motion which is too extreme and the entire balance of the body collapses. When we're trying to create realistic poses and animation, what we're actually trying to do is find those checks and balances that help the character stay grounded and the movement have a feeling of weight to it. So, when you understand how and when your character is balanced, you can basically always know which poses you're going to draw in order to create the correct movement. So let's see how we're going to find the character balance. In general, the object will be balanced as long as its center of mass is above the base. Now, the base is any sort of contact point between the object or character and the environment. Usually it's going to be your legs as you're standing on them, but when you're making a lying position or when you're using any other object such as a cane or a chair or a branch to give you additional contact points, you can enlarge your base and change its shape. The bigger your base is, the easier it is for the character to stay balanced and stationary, because the longer the center of mass needs to travel in order to get unbalanced. As you can see here in this example, the higher the center of mass is, the easier it is to unbalance your character. The angle that is required to make the character fall is a little bit smaller than the shorter character, especially if they have a good stance, but even if they are in a more unbalanced position, it is easier to topple over the taller character. If your character is disproportionate, the location of the center of mass is going to change a little bit. So if they have really thick legs, for example, it's going to be lower and it's going to be harder to topple them over. Or if they have a much more top-heavy design, it's going to be easier to unbalance them even if they are using a more balanced stance. It's important to analyze where is your character's center of mass is, because this gives you the best understanding on the movement range of the character, before you are required to make extreme motions and poses. Otherwise, you might accidentally create poses or animation which does not look correct because the balance is weird. When your characters are more easy to unbalance, the range of movement is actually going to be smaller, and the effect of each one of their movements is going to have on their overall balance is going to be much more noticeable. Because the body always strives to stay balanced, each time your object or character is unbalanced, you will have movement, and by understanding where the center of mass is, you know how much movement you're going to have. In the last two sections, we've looked at how force, mass, and acceleration are related, and how the center of mass affects your character movement by changing its balance point, which affects its overall range of movement. Now we will combine these two concepts to see how the movement of a certain mass in your character, such as a limb or the entire body, will affect the rest of the body. The thing that connects these two concepts together is momentum. This is not actually the scientific definition, but for our purposes, momentum is the force which is created by a moving mass. When one part of the body moves independently of the rest of it, this creates its own force, and the bigger the mass, the more force is required to start and stop the movement. As I've told you at the beginning, you need force to start a movement, which creates acceleration, and you also need force to stop a movement. The momentum is not a real force, which is continuously acting upon an object. It's basically just the residual force which initially created the movement. And what keeps the movement going even though there is no active force, which is acting upon the moving object. As we've seen before, the bigger the object, the harder it is to make it move. This is the same for when it stops moving. So if your object is already moving and has a large amount of mass to it, it's going to stop a lot slower than a smaller object. This makes it so it has its own independent trajectory, which actually affects the rest of the body. So when we're trying to animate more complex objects with more complex movement, what we're actually doing is basically connecting different types of momentum in different types of trajectories. Basically, each moving part of your body creates its own momentum. This momentum acts like a force on the rest of the body and creates a chain reaction which shapes the way that we're going to pose the characters. And because mass, acceleration, and force are connected, we're going to see 3 different scenarios on how we express this momentum, and how we're going to use it, and the balance point of the character to choose the correct poses for our animation, as well as connect them in a realistic manner. My thought process when animating relies on understanding the forces which are acting on each part of the body, how they make it react, and how the body tries to balance itself to find the poses that are most suitable for my timing and the movement that I'm trying to show. In this example, I'm going to show you how to express mass using momentum and balance with the body. So in this example, we can see that the hand has its own mass with the way that it's accelerating. But the movement doesn't look very realistic because it's not affecting the rest of the body. The momentum is missing. Now, the more mass a certain body part has, the more momentum it's going to have, and the more it's going to affect the rest of the body. To create balance, the body is going to move to the opposite direction of that of the hand, to try and shift the center of gravity onto the base on both sides of the connection points, which is the leg. Now, because the hand is quite big, it has a lot of momentum, so the force which is required to stop it will be bigger as well. So the overall range is going to be bigger because it's going to take more time to stop it, and we're going to be using more frames to show the delay in the acceleration and reacceleration of the object because it has more mass to it. Basically, we're going to be using the delay technique that we've seen in the last lesson to emphasize the weight of the hand. I also added a secondary movement of the other hand raising up, because we want to show how the body is trying to balance itself by extending the mass of the other hand to the other direction and shifting the center of mass more to the opposing side of the moving hand. Finally, when the hand comes down, we want to show its mass by making the initial movement slow, because it requires a large amount of force to accelerate, and we're going to make the acceleration itself a lot quicker and uneven, because the character doesn't have enough strength to resist the acceleration of the large mass of the hand on the way down. By moving the center of mass quickly over the base, we create more balance and see the character straighten again. Second example, let's see how we're going to use momentum to show force as opposed to mass, like the first example. Here we have two variations of a punch. The one on the left doesn't look very strong, even though we use the acceleration and overshoot to give it extra energy. Again, this is because it doesn't have momentum, which affects the rest of the body. Before, when a large force is applied to a small object, it accelerates quickly and moves fast. To show this, we simply make the punch change position and accelerate more quickly, meaning that the spacing between each frame is going to be bigger than on the punch on the left. To compensate for this larger range, we are going to shift the pose of the entire body to make it seem more realistic and actually give the larger range to the character. Now, the hand movement creates its own momentum. And even though the mass of the hand is small in comparison to the body, the amount of force behind it is big. So we want to still show a large momentum. And we will be showing this momentum by the effect it has on the rest of the body. Because we're trying to increase the range, and because there is a large force which is affecting the body, the center of mass is going to move more to the side, in direction as the punch. He will always try and balance itself. So when the momentum makes the center of gravity follow the punch and unbalance, you will have to change the pose in a way that shifts the center of mass back to the other direction. This can be done by extending the limbs to the other direction to get more mass over to the base, by actually increasing the base, or even by changing the location of the supporting leg and just changing the overall position of the character altogether. If you're really trying to sell the idea of force behind a punch or a movement, you can just break the balance completely and make extreme movement and unbalance your character before making it shift to another position, stage, or even make it fall. In this example, I still want to keep my character balanced, so by making it extend the leg, we both make the base bigger and move some of the body's mass to the opposite direction of the punch, which keeps the center of mass over the supporting leg and keeping the character balanced. Here, the body is actually at the very edge of its balanced range. So as long as we keep its proportion correctly, we know where the movement and the poses has to stop for the maximum effect. If we go above this range, the character will become unstable and fall. If we go below this range, it wouldn't seem like the character is putting all their force behind the punch. So basically, when you're trying to create complex animation and figure out which poses you need to make, you just need to think about how and when your character is balanced and how to break this balance or get to the very edge of the movement range to show the maximum amount of force behind the movement. This is true for any type of actions that you're trying to animate with any types of object. So it's a good idea to try and figure out the forces working behind each movement that you're trying to draw before actually thinking and planning it. Even if you just write it as a note, you don't need to actually calculate it or anything. For a third example, let's see what happens when the body is affected by an external force. Up until now, the character itself was the one instigating the movement, so they have control over it. But a lot of the time you will see external forces affecting characters. You can see that in fighting, you can see that with terrain, or you can see that with additional weight or specialized item and clothing. You can also show external forces using momentum. In these cases, similarly to internal forces, you need to recognize the direction each force exerts on each part of the body. This is where understanding how the momentum creates some kind of chain reaction in the body becomes really important. Because the amount of momentum each body part exerts on the rest of the body is going to affect the amount and direction of the movement of the rest of the body. Because this time we don't actually have the body balancing itself or a base that we can compare the center of mass to. In this case, a force which is too big for the body to counter is acting on the hand. I'll be showing this by using quick acceleration of the hand and by making it travel a large distance on the screen. Now the hand applies force to the rest of the body because, well, it is connected. So the rest of the body is going to follow the trajectory of the hand. But because the hand's mass is smaller, it's going to accelerate much faster than the rest of the body, which has larger mass. Meaning that there is going to be a delay between the hand and the body, because one is going to accelerate for a longer distance and much quicker than the rest of it. We're going to express this by changing the angle that the body creates. Because the main body is going to travel a shorter distance due to it having a smaller mass and having a smaller force acting on it. The character is going to come to a rest once again when the center of mass reaches the point above the base. In this case, the character is too unbalanced, so it's going to reach a complete fall. Here I'm going to use secondary action, and due to momentum, the second hand, which is still not at a resting position when the rest of the body hits the floor, is going to continue its trajectory because of its own momentum until it's going to hit the floor as well, which creates a delay. The important thing to remember about momentum is that it's not something that comes directly from the muscle or a propelling force, but this is something that occurs because your object is already in motion. Momentum alone will not start a movement, but it will try to continue an existing one. So basically, a momentum will keep each object moving in its own trajectory unless there is a larger force which is acting on the object and changing its trajectory. This will come into play when you try and stop an action. And why we usually show momentum in animation? Through the way it affects other objects, through delay in timing and making larger trajectories on the details which are following the main action. By following the thought process of where the force is, how much momentum it's going to create, and how this affects the trajectory of the rest of the body or the details of the character design, we can predict how we're going to plan the action and which poses we're going to draw to make it look more natural. Now that we have a better idea on how momentum and force are going to affect the action that we're animating, both the timing, spacing, and amount of frames that it's going to take, and what poses we're going to make in order to keep our character balanced and show the force behind the movement, we want to actually try and connecting multiple different actions together. In this exercise, I'm going to show you my thought process when animating multiple actions together. Basically, what I'm going to do is connect multiple different poses in a way that makes sense and keeps a certain flow and energy. I'm going to show you around 4 poses, but you can do either 1 or 2 or play around with both full body or certain parts of the body moving independently. The point of this exercise is to learn how to analyze forces acting on different parts of the body and how we're going to use the animation techniques that we learned in the last lesson to connect between multiple different actions. So to remind you, we show speed by changing the distance between each frame, and we're creating acceleration and deceleration, which shows us force and mass, by changing the actual size of the spacing between each frame. To help visualize speed, we're going to use smear frames and the idea of squash and stretch. And to show impact, we're going to use overshoot and impact frames, as well as emphasize certain actions using delay in timing. When you're choosing your action for this exercise, make sure that you're trying both full body actions and individual body part actions to get the best experience and see how you get full body effects in both of them. For the first 15 pose, the entire body is going to change position, meaning that by necessity, the arms, which are connected to the body, are going to be changing position as well. But I'm going to also move the arm independently from the main body movement, so it's a secondary action. This movement of the arm makes it so that they have their own momentum, but it doesn't have enough mass or force behind the movement to make a significant change in the position of the center of mass, especially since we're making the base bigger and lowering the center of mass with the new pose. We're still going to be using overshoots in both the squatting position and of the range of the hand to show the energy of the movement. Without using the overshoot, it would have seemed like the character is slowly easing itself down, instead of crouching down with a large amount of energy. The second shift in position, on the other hand, does have a lot of force behind it, So although the mass of the arm is smaller than the rest of the body, the center of mass does change its position to accommodate for the movement. The momentum of the hand is going to make the rest of the body follow the hand's trajectory, and the body will try and balance itself. So it's going to overshoot to show the force behind the movement, but then it's going to go back to show the balance of the body. Next, we have a shift in the amount of contact points and the size of the base. We want the character to completely change the position of the center of mass to go above the new contact point and the smaller base. So first, we're going to show a new force which is coming from the character's legs and pushing it over to the new position. But this new force can only work on the character for a single moment, because then it raises its leg and it's no longer in contact with the ground, so there's nothing to push. What actually helps the character to complete the new change in position is the momentum that this initial kick creates, as well as the additional momentum which is created by shifting the arms of the character to the other direction and closer to the center of gravity above the new base point. This shift in both mass and force helps the character reach a new position more naturally. This also helps us understand where we need to position each limb at each point along the trajectory. Remember that the force is acting on the character only at the bottom part of the trajectory, so it's going to use an ease-out animation pattern. We're going to have large changes in pose at the beginning of the movement, and then as the character reaches to a stop, we're going to have a small amount of changes in each body part. Lastly, we're going to see how the character is keeping balance after making a very abrupt and big movement. Here I made the character balance after spinning by making it extend its limbs in opposite directions to counterbalance the momentum of the body movement. Here, the goal is basically to create a new momentum by using the trajectory of the limbs, which is opposite to the direction of the spin. We extend both limbs because we want to keep the balance of the mass of the body. In this demonstration, I decided to let the character keep its balance. But if I would have changed any type of conditions within the movement or the character design, it would have resulted in a completely different action. Each increase in the force of each action or the mass of the limbs would have created a momentum which is too strong for the character to balance, which would have made it fall or stumble in its action. While if not enough force was added to each movement, the character might not have enough momentum to complete their trajectory when shifting between poses. Each change would have given us a completely different outcome for the movement, so you need to understand the concepts of momentum, mass, acceleration, and balance to choose the correct poses, timing, and spacing. Up until now, we've talked about animation in a pretty straightforward manner. Basically, you just see what forces are acting on each part of your character, analyze them, and then decide your trajectories according to them. But we haven't talked about how to make your entire animation more appealing and good looking. But we haven't talked about how to make it more realistic, more appealing, and make it stand out in comparison to other animations. For this, there are two important things that we need to think about whenever we're trying to animate any type of movement, beyond the regular understanding of which trajectory we're going to make and what poses will make it look good. The secret to doing this is using your timing correctly. By using it correctly, I don't mean to understand the timing of each individual movement in your entire sequence, but actually how to time every single movement in comparison to each other. Most of the time, when people animate, they either make each movement separately from each other, one after the other, like a chain, usually with each new movement lasting the same amount of time as the one before it, or they try and make multiple motions together, but they don't actually affect or relate to each other all that much. And a lot of the time, the body will move as one mass, so there wouldn't be a delay between each part of the body, aside from what you will see from regular momentum. But good-looking and realistic animation is actually created by creating a good pacing between each individual movement, as well as creating different beats for each length of each action. By this I mean that whenever you're trying to animate a sequence of movements, you need to make sure that each part has a slightly different timing and overall length to create a more realistic and nice-looking pacing. Another important thing to consider is that the actual movement of the body or mass is going to take time. You need to make sure that each movement that you're making has enough time to start and stop naturally, as well as give some delay for the audience to perceive the movement. This relates to the principle of anticipations that we've talked about in a previous lesson. Basically, you want to give enough time for wind up and wind down of every movement that you're trying to make. You want to make sure that the action trajectory is always completed between movements, and that you have enough time to perceive it. By completing the trajectory, you're usually going to shift the character center of mass as well, especially if the movements are quite big or quite sudden. This means that you want to shift the entire body into different direction, adding the additional movements that created by that. Ideally, you want to have a slightly different pacing and timing for each body part of your character whenever it is making big movements like that, and have enough time for each part to complete its own trajectory. You will also want to have some variation with the entire movement. For example, if you're making your character stand up or down or spin, you want to make sure that each part that follows the initial action has slight delay and slightly different timing to create more appealing movement. So basically, the formula for creating nice looking movement and pacing is to break down your initial actions into main body action and slightly different secondary actions that result from it, and then create some changes with the timing of each action of each body part. Finally, you want to give enough time for each action to be complete, as well as make sure that the entire body weight shifts accordingly. When your action is only starting, you want to give enough space and a little bit of a wind-up before you actually perform the main action, so your character may go backwards to enlarge the overall trajectory. This also requires some delay and some additional pacing of different body parts. You might even want to add some secondary movements of other body parts that don't participate in the main action in the middle of performing other part of the main action. This will help you to have more detail and more natural pacing to the overall animation. I can't stress this enough, but the secret to good-looking actions is having contrast between your fast and slow actions. You want to have enough variation in your pacing to create something that looks interesting and natural with the weight shifts of your character, both with the main body action and the secondary actions that result from it. And if you feel that your animation is looking kind of bland or unnatural, try spicing it up by creating variations with these ideas in mind. Up until now, we focused on how the forces affect the actions and trajectories and poses that we are going to choose. But another thing that we need to consider is the timing. The timing is actually extremely important because it both gives you the limit on how many frames you're going to draw, which will be done by either the actual length of the scene or by your own workload. And it's also going to give you the pacing of your action, which lets you emphasize certain parts of it. Even if your overall timing is determined in advance by the length of the scene, you can still play around with the actual speed and emphasis of the movement by changing the timing and actions of your character. We kind of saw that in the last lesson with the way that each ball in the animation pattern section looked like it moved in a different time than the rest of them, even though the amount of frames was the same. The general rule of thumb was to make a small amount of frames for quick movements and a large amount of frames for slower movements. This is also very useful when you're trying to connect different movements and show different momentums, because you can basically break any type of movement into smaller sub-movements, each one of them with their own ease-in and ease-out pattern. In order to create nice-looking and natural movements, what you need to do is basically realize where your character is stopping and for how long they're stopping. Once you know where they're stopping, you can just add additional frames to show the connection movement between each stop. And by controlling the speed of the movement and how much distance you have between each pose, you can understand how to time your entire animation correctly. Here you can see the difference between the large movement in the action, which has more energy and impact to them, and the smaller actions. I just let the character have more time in the key poses to show the emphasis of the impact and the range of the movement. While on smaller movements, I let the character change position rather quickly and not let them delay on the connecting poses. Of course, on each small part of the movement, I'm going to use the ease in and ease out animation concepts, as well as try and check the balance and forces working on the character and add secondary movement as necessary. For this process, I actually find that using the pose-to-pose method of animation is a lot more useful because you know which movements and poses are important and just add the additional frames to create better timing and pacing to the overall animation. If you've been following along with your exercise, see where you choose to pause and move your character and how you chose to balance it or make it fall and get out of balance. See if there are any places in the movement where you can emphasize and give it more impact by adding additional frames to create sort of delays which let us anticipate the action. If you do have places like these, see if you need to add additional frames or if you can actually space your character poses a little bit differently to create the same effect while keeping the same number of frames. Remember that as animators, especially independent animators, our goal is to draw the least amount of frames that we can make to have the right effect of the action that we're aiming for. Because each new frames that we are going to make is going to be additional time and work on the production. Also, Instead of adding and subtracting frames, see if there are places where you can create a delay simply by making your animation on 2s or 3s instead of 1s. I myself actually go the opposite way and draw everything on 3s and then see if I can increase the speed of certain parts of the action by making it on 2s and 1s. This makes it so that I have the most efficient animation that I can make, because I start with the lower frame rate and then go on the higher frame rate when necessary. The exercise in this lesson, if you haven't been following along, is to create your own version of the examples that I've given throughout this video. I recommend making a sequence of 3 movements, but you can also make 1 or 2 actions if you're new to animation, as long as they involve the entire body. When choosing the actions for your sequence, make sure that you have 1 shift in your center of mass, 1 shift of a limb which creates movement in the center of mass, and 1 change in your balance and base size of your character. This will help you understand how to create different movements and connect them using momentum. You can try and work with internal or external forces as you see fit. And you can create different variations where your character keeps or loses its balance. The more you experience with these types of animations, the better your understanding on the forces working on your character are going to be. So the easier it's going to be to animate later on. Make sure that you keep your character's proportions and volumes correct, and that you take into account the different masses of your character design when animating. Again, you want to make sure that you're not having any jittering effects, so you need to have a clear path and see that no parts of your character is accidentally going backwards in their trajectory, which will create the effect. This is especially important if you have slow movements, which requires very small spacing between frames. And lastly, for the best exercise quality, try and create your characters while keeping your sketch to the minimum number of lines. To recap, in today's lesson we've learned the concept of mass, force, and momentum, how to analyze your movements according to them, and how to show them through acceleration and shifting with your character balance to create the correct poses for our animation, as well as playing around with our timing and spacing of the poses to create more interesting and varied actions in our animation. Next lesson, we're going to learn about animating objects and showing their characteristics and details using different animation techniques, as well as how to apply these objects and techniques to the details that we're going to add to the character design. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!